My parents left a wrapped box on my doorstep with one warning: do not make a scene. Then they drove off. I opened it and nearly dropped to my knees. Trembling, I dialed 911. Minutes later, my husband stepped inside, saw two officers in our home, and turned pale. Please do not tell me they actually did it. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Kiera. I am 32 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant. Growing up in a middle-class African-American household in Atlanta, my parents Calvin and Brenda cared about two things above all else: their standing in the local church community and preserving the grand illusion of generational wealth. I was never the child who fit their perfect picture. That role belonged entirely to my younger sister Brielle. She was the beauty queen, the social butterfly, the golden child who could simply do no wrong. I was just the quiet girl who liked numbers and preferred staying out of the spotlight. They thought I was intensely boring. They thought I was safe to manipulate. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. The box they left on my porch was wrapped in expensive thick silver paper and tied with a pristine silk ribbon. It looked exactly like a lavish late birthday gift. But when I pulled the lid off, my breath literally caught in my throat. Inside, resting delicately on a bed of white tissue paper, were 8 credit cards. They were sliced cleanly in half. Platinum cards, gold premium cards, business accounts, and high-tier travel rewards cards. Every single one of them had my full name printed on the bottom. Beneath the plastic pieces lay a thick stack of heavy legal documents. The top page was a formal debt collection notice from a major national bank. The total amount due, printed in bold black ink, was staggering: $400,000. Pinned to the top of the collection notice was a handwritten note on my mother personalized heavy cardstock stationery. The elegant cursive letters read, "Spencer needed capital for his new venture. We borrowed your identity to secure the loans because family helps family. You have a good job and you can take care of yourself. Do not make a scene and ruin your sister's marriage. We will handle the payments eventually." I did not cry. The young, vulnerable girl who used to cry in her bedroom when her parents drained her hard-earned college savings to pay for Brielle to enter expensive beauty pageants was long gone. When I was a teenager, I worked at a local grocery store to save money for a laptop I needed for my advanced placement classes. I saved for 10 months. One afternoon, I came home to find the cash missing from my shoebox. My mother had taken it to buy Brielle a designer dress for the homecoming dance. When I confronted them, my father told me that Brielle needed to look the part to secure a good future, and that I was smart enough to figure out another way to get my computer. That was the day I realized my sole purpose in this family was to be an invisible resource for my sister. I left for college a year later, paid my own tuition through grants and multiple jobs, and never asked them for a single dime. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity wash over my entire body. I picked up my cell phone and immediately dialed the police. My husband Devin walked through the front door just as the 2 uniformed officers were taking down my initial statement. Devin is a trauma surgeon. He is incredibly used to high-stress life or death situations, but seeing the police standing in our quiet suburban foyer made him stop dead in his tracks. He dropped his medical bag, looked at the sliced credit cards scattered on the console table, and then looked at the collection notice resting in the officer's hands. He rubbed his face in disbelief and let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. "Please do not tell me they actually did it," he whispered. "They did?" I said, my voice completely deadpan. $400,000 worth of identity fraud. Devin walked over and wrapped his strong arm around my waist, standing firmly by my side. For years, he had quietly watched my family belittle my career and dismiss my accomplishments. They constantly called me a glorified calculator. They mocked our deliberate decision to live in a modest, comfortable home while we quietly built massive wealth and diversified investments. They practically worshipped Brielle's husband Spencer. Spencer was a white man from a family that constantly claimed to have old money. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove a leased luxury Porsche, and spoke to my parents with a subtle, condescending tone that they somehow blindly mistook for high-class sophistication. Spencer loved to throw around complicated financial buzzwords at our Sunday family dinners, implying that my job as an accountant was merely counting pennies, while he made the real Wall Street moves that generated actual wealth. Devin knew this history. He knew the deep scars left by decades of emotional neglect. When we first met in college, he was amazed by how fiercely independent I was. He saw the brilliance in my analytical mind that my parents always dismissed as boring. As a trauma surgeon, Devin dealt with physical wounds every single day, but he always told me that the emotional wounds my family inflicted on me required just as much careful healing. He held my hand through the tough years when my parents would conveniently forget my birthday, but throw lavish parties for Brielle. Now standing in our foyer watching me face the ultimate betrayal, his grip on my waist was a silent promise that he would never let them hurt me again. The older police officer asked me to detail exactly how I discovered the fraud. I explained that I check my credit report quarterly. The alerts had been suppressed because the contact email was changed to an obscure address I did not recognize, but the physical mail finally caught up when the debt was sent to collections. They had intercepted the initial warnings by changing the mailing address to a post office box, before finally defaulting and letting the final notice slip through to my actual home. It was calculated. It was malicious. It was a highly coordinated effort to bypass fraud detection systems. "Ma'am," the officer said, looking up from his notepad and tapping the legal documents. These loans and credit lines were opened online over the course of 14 months. The shipping addresses, secondary email accounts, and alternative contact numbers all lead directly back to your parents' primary residence. If you choose to proceed with this report, we have to actively investigate your family for felony identity theft and major wire fraud. Once this process starts, you cannot easily stop it. Are you absolutely certain you want to press criminal charges against your own parents? I looked down at the handwritten note my mother had so casually written. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement of it was sickening. The absolute disregard for my life, my carefully maintained credit score, and my financial future was unforgivable. They honestly believed I would just silently absorb nearly $500,000 of crippling debt simply because they demanded it of me. They genuinely thought the old toxic dynamic of me sacrificing everything for Brielle comfort and lifestyle would continue forever without any consequences. I am completely certain, I told the officer, my voice steady and resolute. I want to press full criminal charges. I want this documented immediately, and I want to press forward with the investigation. The officers nodded sympathetically and explained they would need to pay a visit to the address listed on the fraudulent accounts to ask some preliminary questions. My parents' address. Devin grabbed his car keys from the hook by the door. "We are going too," he said firmly. "I am not letting you face them alone tonight." The drive to my parents' house took exactly 20 tense minutes. It was Sunday evening. I knew exactly what was happening inside their home right at this moment. It was their sacred, highly curated Sunday dinner after church. The massive oak dining room table would be covered in expensive catering that they probably paid for using my stolen credit cards. Calvin and Brenda would be holding court, pouring expensive wine for Spencer and hanging onto his every arrogant word. They probably thought the silver box they left on my porch had successfully silenced me. They thought I was sitting at home crying into a pillow, too terrified of ruining the precious family name to actually do anything about it. We pulled up to the large, 2-story brick house just as the 2 police cruisers parked along the curb. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the perfectly manicured lawn my father was so incredibly proud of. Devin squeezed my hand tightly before we got out of our car. "Let the police do the talking," he advised gently. "You just stand your ground and do not let them intimidate you." The officers walked up the brick pathway and knocked loudly on the heavy mahogany front door. For a moment there was complete silence from inside. Then the door swung open, revealing my mother. Brenda was wearing a pristine silk blouse and her signature string of pearls. She held a crystal wine glass in one hand, looking like the picture of suburban grace. The polite, welcoming smile on her face instantly vanished when she saw the police uniform standing on her porch. Then her eyes darted frantically to the driveway and landed squarely on me and Devon. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice growing shrill and defensive. "Good evening, ma'am," the officer said, maintaining a professional tone. "We are looking for Calvin and Brenda. We received an official report regarding stolen identity and fraudulent financial accounts linked directly to this address." My father Calvin quickly appeared behind her, wiping his mouth nervously with a linen napkin. "What is going on out here?" he asked, his voice booming. When he saw the police, his chest puffed up instinctively, trying to project authority and control the narrative. "There must be some terrible mistake, officers. We are upstanding, respected members of this community. We host the church council in this very home every single month." "There is no mistake, Dad," I said, stepping onto the porch and moving into the light. Devon stood close behind me, a silent, immovable wall of support. "You took out $400,000 in loans under my name. You left the chopped-up credit cards on my doorstep like it was some kind of sick joke." I handed all the physical evidence directly to the police. My mother let out a dramatic, exaggerated gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. She turned to the officers with wide, innocent, pleading eyes. "Officers, you have to excuse my daughter," she said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "She is severely mentally unstable. She has been having a terrible psychiatric breakdown lately because she is so intensely jealous of her younger sister. We were just talking at dinner about getting her committed for psychiatric help. She is making all of this up to hurt our family and ruin our evening." The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. She was willing to label me completely insane to armed police officers rather than admit what she had done to her own flesh and blood. But the officers were not easily swayed by her performance. "Ma'am, we have the physical documents," the officer replied, holding up a clear plastic evidence bag containing my mother's handwritten note. This note explicitly details borrowing Kiara identity for capital. It matches your handwriting and your personal stationery. We are going to need to come inside and ask some very specific questions about these transactions. Before my father could launch into another loud protest, a new voice cut sharply through the tension. It was Spencer. He walked out of the dining room holding a glass of expensive scotch, looking perfectly relaxed and utterly arrogant. He stepped deliberately in front of my parents, positioning himself between the police and my family as if he were a magical shield of white privilege that could make the law disappear. "Gentlemen, let us lower the temperature here," Spencer said, using that smooth, condescending tone I absolutely despised. "I am Spencer. I handle the wealth management and investments for this family. What we have here is simply a civil misunderstanding stemming from some highly emotional Black women who do not understand high-level finance. My sister-in-law, Kiara, tends to overreact to complex financial restructuring. There is absolutely no need for law enforcement to be involved in a private family matter. I will have my private attorney call your precinct in the morning to clear this entire mess up." I stared at him in utter disbelief. He had just casually dismissed felony fraud as a civil misunderstanding and deliberately threw in a racist, sexist microaggression to make me look like an angry, irrational woman who could not comprehend numbers. He actually thought his expensive custom suit and confident, commanding tone would make the police apologize, turn around, and walk away. "It is not a civil misunderstanding, Spencer," I said, my voice ringing out clearly and powerfully in the cool night air. "Identity theft is a federal crime, and wire fraud is a felony." Spencer chuckled condescendingly, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "Kiara, sweetheart, leave the heavy lifting to the professionals. You sit in a gray cubicle doing basic math all day. You do not understand how venture capital works. The family simply leveraged an unused asset, your good credit score, to secure necessary funding for my new investment portfolio. You will be repaid with interest when the project scales and goes public. Now tell these officers you made a silly mistake before I am forced to sue you for defamation and completely ruin what little career you have left." Devin stepped forward, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. Do not speak to my wife like that, Spencer. You are standing in a house funded by stolen money trying to intimidate the victim of your crime. My mother shoved her way past Spencer, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. You are ruining our Sunday dinner. You are embarrassing us in front of the entire neighborhood. If you do not tell these officers to leave right now, you are dead to me, Kiara. Do you hear me? I will make sure no one in our church ever speaks to you again. I looked at the people who were supposed to be my loving family. My father, who was sweating profusely but saying absolutely nothing to defend me. My mother, who was completely willing to destroy my reputation to protect a thief. And Spencer, the arrogant mastermind, who thought he could steal nearly $500,000 from my future and demand a thank you note in return. They truly believed I was just a quiet little accountant who would bow her head and take the abuse to keep the peace. They had absolutely no idea that my job as a forensic accountant meant I investigated global corporate fraud for a living. I did not just do basic math, I dismantled financial criminals. You can try to sue me for defamation, Spencer, I said, maintaining absolute unwavering eye contact with him. But I think you will find that truth is an absolute defense in court. I already ran the routing numbers on the accounts you fraudulently opened in my name. Spencer's smug, confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I know exactly where that $400,000 went. I continued, my voice echoing across the porch so the neighbors could hear. And I cannot wait to explain to the police, to my parents, and to your so-called investors how you really run your portfolios. The officers stepped forward, asking Spencer to step aside immediately. The official investigation was beginning, and my family carefully constructed house of cards was about to catch fire. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers faded into the distance as Devin and I drove back to our quiet home in the suburbs. The silence in our car was heavy, but for the first time in my life, it was not weighed down by guilt or obligation. It was the silence of a coming storm. The official investigation was beginning, and my family carefully constructed house of cards was about to catch fire. The next morning was Sunday. Traditionally, this meant waking up early to prepare a side dish for the mandatory family dinner after church. I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking black coffee when my phone began to vibrate against the marble countertop. The caller ID displayed my father name, Calvin. I let it ring 4 times before sliding my finger across the screen to answer. His voice was tight, vibrating with a suppressed rage that he was desperately trying to mask with paternal authority. Kiara. He began, his tone low and dangerous. You are coming to Sunday dinner today. We are going to sit down as a family, break bread, and fix this internally. We have generational wealth and a reputation to protect, and I will not have my own daughter tearing down our legacy over a misunderstanding. Do not embarrass us by not showing up. Then the line went dead. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not apologize for the massive fraudulent debt in my name. He only cared about the optics. Devin walked into the kitchen tying his scrub pants. He had heard the one-sided conversation. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, looking at me with deep concern. You do not have to go, he said softly. You owe them absolutely nothing. Let the police handle it. I looked at the sleek leather briefcase sitting on the chair next to me. Inside that briefcase was a heavily encrypted laptop and physical printouts of data I had been compiling since 3 in the morning. I am going, I told my husband. If I do not go, they will spend the entire afternoon crafting a narrative where I am the villain. I am going to let them say everything they need to say, and then I am going to burn their generational wealth illusion to the ground. Devin nodded slowly. He knew better than to stop me when my mind was set. He kissed my forehead and told me to call him the second I needed him to come get me. The drive back to my parents' house felt entirely different in the daylight. The sprawling suburban estate looked exactly as it always did. The meticulously manicured lawn, the pristine white columns, the expensive cars parked in the circular driveway. It was the ultimate facade of Black excellence that my parents had dedicated their entire lives to projecting. They had spent decades building this image of perfection, making sure everyone in our church community viewed them as the pinnacle of success. I walked up the brick steps, clutching my leather briefcase tightly. I did not bother knocking. I used my old key and pushed the heavy mahogany door open. The smell of roasted chicken collard greens and baked macaroni and cheese filled the air. It was a smell that used to mean comfort and safety, but today it just smelled like hypocrisy and deceit. I walked slowly down the hallway, the familiar sounds of my family echoing from the formal dining room. They were already seated, acting as if the police had not just been on their front porch the night before. I walked into the dining room. The heavy oak table was set with my mother's finest china and crystal glasses. My father sat at the head of the table wearing a crisp suit, despite having changed out of his church clothes. My mother Brenda sat to his right, her face a mask of tight hostility. Her signature pearls rested against her silk blouse, a stark contrast to the ugly truth of what she had done to me. Brielle and Spencer sat across from them. Brielle was wearing a designer dress that cost more than my first car, and she was already dabbing her eyes with a linen napkin, playing the tragic victim before I even pulled out a chair. Spencer sat next to her, looking completely unbothered by the fact that he was facing federal charges. He swirled a glass of iced bourbon, resting his arm casually over the back of Brielle's chair. "Sit down, Kiara," my father ordered, pointing to the empty chair at the far end of the table. "We have a lot to discuss, and we are going to do this like civilized adults." I took my seat, placing the leather briefcase on the floor right next to my feet. I did not touch the food. I just folded my hands on the table and waited. Brielle let out a loud, dramatic sob the moment I sat down. "How could you do this to us?" she cried out, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me. "Spencer is trying to build something incredible for this family. He is trying to secure our future and elevate our generational wealth. He just needed a little bit of bridge capital to get his new venture off the ground. You have a great credit score that you literally never use because you live in that boring little house and refuse to enjoy life. We are family, Kiara. You are supposed to sacrifice for the family. Now you are trying to send my husband to jail over a temporary loan that he was going to pay back." Spencer chuckled, a low, patronizing sound that made my skin crawl. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the expensive mahogany table. "Let us be real here, Kiara," he said, using that familiar condescending tone that my parents somehow mistook for sophistication. "You are just a glorified receipt checker. You sit in a cubicle all day, matching up invoices and pushing papers. You do not understand how high-level finance works. You do not understand venture capital or leveraging assets to create liquidity. Leave the real money to the Wall Street minds." I was going to pay off those credit cards next month when my offshore investments yielded their first quarter dividends. "You calling the police was a massive overreaction from someone who simply lacks business acumen," my mother chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. "You have always been like this, Kiara. Always so rigid, always so selfish. You never wanted to see your sister succeed." Brielle nodded vigorously, dabbing her dry eyes again. "That is exactly what this is about," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "You have been jealous of me our entire lives. You have been holding a grudge ever since Mom took your college savings fund to pay for my pageant fees and my modeling portfolio. You have always resented the fact that I was the one destined for greatness while you were just ordinary. You are using this tiny financial misunderstanding to finally get revenge on me because you could never stand being in my shadow." I sat there and let the words wash over me. I let them dig their own graves with every arrogant syllable. I looked at my father, who was nodding along with Brielle's ridiculous narrative. I looked at my mother, who was glaring at me with pure disgust. I looked at Spencer, who was smiling that smug, entitled white savior smile, believing he had completely outsmarted a room full of people. They truly thought I was just going to sit there and take the abuse just like I had done when I was a teenager. They thought my silence was submission. They did not realize my silence was simply me waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I reached down and picked up my leather briefcase. I placed it directly on top of the fine china plates and the crystal glasses. My mother gasped as the heavy leather brushed against her pristine table setting. "What are you doing?" My father demanded, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "Get that bag off the table immediately." I unclasped the brass locks. They echoed sharply in the silent dining room. I opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of financial documents that was nearly 3 inches thick. I did not just hand it to them. I dropped the massive file right into the center of the table. It landed with a heavy thud, knocking over the expensive crystal gravy boat. The thick brown gravy spilled out, pooling across the white lace tablecloth and staining it completely ruined. My mother shrieked, jumping back from the table, but I did not blink. "You call washing $400,000 through the Cayman Islands to pay off underground gambling debts Wall Street?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. The silence in the dining room was so absolute you could hear the gravy dripping onto the hardwood floor. Spencer's smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. "Did you really think I was just a glorified receipt checker, Spencer?" I asked, leaning forward and locking my eyes onto his suddenly pale face. "Did you honestly believe that someone with your sloppy amateur financial footprint could steal my identity without me tracing every single digital breadcrumb you left behind?" My parents looked back and forth between me and Spencer, completely bewildered by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "Let me reintroduce myself," I said, standing up from the table. "I do not just do taxes. My actual title is Senior Forensic Financial Investigator for a global corporate intelligence firm. I track down international money launderers, embezzlement rings, and financial terrorists for a living. I am the person the government calls when Wall Street minds try to hide their stolen money. And you, Spencer, are the sloppiest criminal I have ever had the displeasure of investigating." I pointed to the thick stack of papers soaking up the spilled gravy. "I spent the last 12 hours pulling your entire financial history. You are not building a startup. You do not have a venture capital firm. You do not have offshore investments yielding dividends. What you have is a crippling gambling addiction and massive debts owed to some very dangerous people. You drained Brielle accounts 6 months ago. You secretly remortgaged the luxury cars. And when you ran out of your own money, you manipulated my status-obsessed parents into stealing my social security number so you could take out high-interest loans to cover your losses. You are drowning in debt, Spencer, and you tried to use me as your life raft." Brielle's face drained of all color. She looked at her husband, her perfectly glossed lips parting in absolute horror. "Spencer, what is she talking about?" Brielle whispered, her voice trembling. "Tell them she is lying. Tell them it is for the startup." Spencer could not speak. He was staring at the documents on the table as if they were a live explosive. The arrogant old money facade had completely shattered. He looked like exactly what he was, a desperate, cornered con man who had finally been caught. My father stood up, his hands shaking. "Kiera," he stammered, looking at the complex flowcharts and bank statements visible on the top of the pile. "Is this true? Is this actually true?" "Every word of it," I replied, packing my empty briefcase and snapping it shut. "You wanted to protect your generational wealth, Dad. Well, you just handed it all to a parasite because you were too busy worrying about how you looked at the country club to actually verify who your daughter was marrying. You thought I was the boring disappointment of the family. But I am the only reason you are finding out about this before he bankrupts you, too." I turned and walked toward the front door, leaving the ruined Sunday dinner behind me. I had delivered the truth, and now they had to choke on it. The drive home with Devin was quiet, but my phone did not stop vibrating against the center console. I expected the calls to be apologies. I expected my father to be calling the police on Spencer, or at least begging me to help them untangle the massive web of debt Spencer had trapped them in. I let the phone ring until it went to voicemail, and then I played the message through the car speakers. My father's voice filled the dark car, but he was not angry at the man who had just stolen $400,000. He was furious with me. "Kiera, how dare you humiliate your brother-in-law like that? he yelled into the phone. You marched into my house and emasculated Spencer over some accounting errors. He comes from a good family. He has a pedigree. Do you have any idea how it looks for us to have a successful white businessman in our family? It elevates us. It shows the congregation that we are moving in elite circles. And you just had to try and tear him down, because you could never stand seeing Brielle secure a better life than you. You are going to call Spencer and apologize tomorrow morning, or I swear to God I will make sure everyone in this city knows exactly how unhinged you have become. Devin reached over and turned the radio off. His jaw was tight. He just defended the man who robbed you, he said, his voice laced with absolute disbelief. I stared out the passenger window, watching the streetlights blur past. My parents were so deeply consumed by the illusion of status that they were willing to let Spencer bankrupt them and destroy my identity just to keep their proximity to his perceived whiteness and wealth. They needed his old money facade to validate their standing in the black upper-middle-class community. Admitting he was a broke gambling addict would mean admitting they had been conned, and their pride simply would not allow it. They chose the illusion over their own daughter. I thought the worst of it was over, but I severely underestimated how quickly my mother and sister could weaponize our community against me. My family attended a prominent megachurch in Atlanta. It was the kind of church where social standing dictated where you sat and who you spoke to. My parents had spent 30 years climbing the social ladder of that congregation. On Wednesday evening, Devin and I attended the midweek service just like we always did. The moment we walked through the heavy oak doors, the temperature in the lobby seemed to drop 20 degrees. Women who had known me since I was in the youth choir suddenly found the floor tiles fascinating. Men who golfed with my father turned their backs as Devin approached. The silence was deafening. We took our seats near the back, and before the service even began, the head pastor approached our pew. He was a tall, imposing man who usually greeted us with warm hugs. Tonight, his face was a mask of grave pastoral concern. "Kiera Devin," he said, keeping his voice low but making sure the people in the surrounding pews could see his serious demeanor. "Your parents came to my office yesterday morning in tears. They asked the pastoral care team to pray for you, Kiera. They told me about your mental breakdown. My mother and Brielle had not just spun a lie, they had orchestrated a masterclass in character assassination." The pastor placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, looking at me with pure pity. "Your mother explained how the stress of your job has caused you to hallucinate these financial crimes. She told us how deeply jealous you are of Brielle and Spencer, and how you fabricated a briefcase full of fake bank statements just to try and ruin their marriage." The pastor looked at me with a condescending sorrow that made me sick to my stomach. "Your mother is weeping for your soul, Kiera. She says you have stopped taking your medication and that your barren womb has poisoned your heart against your sister." The sheer evil of that lie hit me like a physical blow. They had weaponized my private painful struggles with fertility from years ago to paint me as a jealous, bitter villain. They knew I had made peace with not having children, but they used it as a knife to carve out my credibility in front of the entire congregation. "We think it is best if you and Devin step away from the church ministries until you seek psychiatric help," the pastor concluded. I looked around the sanctuary. Dozens of eyes were watching us, judging us, whispering behind their programs. Brielle was sitting in the front row wearing a modest floral dress, holding a tissue and looking like a martyred saint. My mother was patting her back. They had completely flipped the narrative. I was no longer the victim of a massive federal crime. I was the bitter, infertile, unhinged sister who was trying to tear down a beautiful, successful marriage because I was losing my mind. They used the very real stigma around mental health to discredit my forensic evidence before I could even take it to trial. Devin stood up, pulling me gently up with him. "Do not touch my wife." "Pastor?" Devin said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet, cavernous space. "You are blindly believing a family of frauds because they write big tithing checks. We are leaving." We walked down the center aisle with our heads held high, but the damage was already done. The smear campaign did not stop at the church doors. It spread like a virus through our entire social network. By Friday morning, the toxic whispers had reached Devon Hospital. Devon was one of the top trauma surgeons in the city, and his reputation was impeccable. But the hospital board included several prominent donors who attended my parents' church. The rumors jumped from the church pews straight into the hospital boardroom. Devon called me on my lunch break, his voice tight with suppressed anger. The chief of surgery just pulled me into his office for a wellness check, Devon told me over the phone. I stopped analyzing the bank statements on my monitor. What do you mean a wellness check? I asked. Devon sighed heavily. Apparently, some of the board members reached out to hospital administration. They heard from your father that you are having a severe psychotic break and that I am living in a state of denial. The chief wanted to know if my home life was compromising my ability to perform surgery. They asked if I needed to take a mandatory leave of absence because my wife is supposedly a danger to herself and others. My hands began to shake, not out of sadness, but out of a deep visceral rage. My parents were not just trying to protect Spencer anymore. They were actively trying to destroy my husband's career just to reinforce their lie. They were willing to ruin the hands that saved lives every single day, just so they would not have to admit their golden son-in-law was a criminal. I told the chief exactly where he could shove his wellness check. Devon continued, his tone turning fiercely protective. I told him my wife is a senior federal financial investigator, and if any board member brings up this slanderous gossip again, I will sue the hospital for workplace harassment. But Kiara, they are escalating. Your dad is out for blood because you challenged his authority. I knew Devon was right. Calvin and Brenda were backed into a corner, and instead of surrendering, they were doubling down. I spent the entire weekend holed up in my home office compiling every single piece of evidence. The glow of my dual monitors was the only light in the room as I dug deeper into the digital dirt Spencer had tried to bury. I had the original credit card applications, the IP addresses showing the applications were submitted from my parents' home Wi-Fi network, the forged signatures, and the wire transfers routing the money from the fraudulent credit lines directly into Spencer offshore gambling accounts. But I did not stop there. I used my professional clearance to pull public records on his so-called venture capital firm. The corporate address was a virtual mail drop in Delaware. The board of directors consisted of shell companies registered in the Bahamas. He had not made a single legitimate trade or investment in his entire life. His entire existence was a carefully constructed pyramid scheme, and my parents were his latest mark. I was preparing a watertight dossier to hand over to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Spencer thought he was dealing with local police who would drop a domestic dispute. He did not realize I was packaging him up for federal tax evasion and wire fraud. The IRS does not care about your church standing or your country club membership. They only care about the paper trail, and I had mapped out a massive digital highway of his financial felonies. It was Monday evening. Devon and I were sitting at the kitchen island eating takeout and reviewing the final pages of the dossier. The rain was beating heavily against the windows, matching the dark mood that had settled over our home. We were ready to pull the trigger and end the charade once and for all. Then the doorbell rang. The sound cut sharply through the quiet house. Devon and I looked at each other. We were not expecting company, and after the harassment we had faced all week, we were both immediately on edge. I will get it, Devon said, standing up and wiping his hands on a napkin. I followed close behind him, standing in the hallway as he opened the heavy front door. A man in a plain beige raincoat stood on our porch, holding a thick manila envelope wrapped in clear plastic to protect it from the rain. Are you Kiara? The man asked, looking past Devon to make direct eye contact with me. Yes, I am, I answered, stepping forward cautiously. The man shoved the wet envelope into my hands. You have been served, he said, turning on his heel and jogging back to his unmarked car parked on the street. He drove away before I could even look down at the package in my hands. My heart hammered against my ribs as I carried the wet envelope into the kitchen. Devin stood next to me, his expression tense as I grabbed a knife and sliced open the thick paper. I pulled out a stack of legal documents stamped with the official seal of the county civil court. I expected it to be a defamation lawsuit from Spencer, just like he had threatened on the porch. I expected a cease and desist order, demanding I stop investigating his fake startup. But as I read the bold black text on the first page, the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. It was not a defense against the fraud. It was an offensive legal strike, and it was entirely directed at Devin. "Calvin is suing us," I whispered, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. Devin took the papers from my shaking hands, his brow furrowing as he read through the allegations. My father was not suing me for defamation. He was suing for full ownership of Devon Private Medical Clinic. 5 years ago, when Devin finished his residency and decided to open his own private trauma recovery and sports medicine clinic, we had funded it entirely ourselves. We lived on ramen noodles and sold my first car just to secure the commercial lease and buy the initial medical equipment. My parents had never contributed a single dime. In fact, they had mocked Devin for leaving a prestigious hospital position to start a risky private practice. But the lawsuit in Devon's hands told a completely different story. According to the court filings, my father was claiming that the entire seed money for the clinic had come from a private family trust. The documents alleged that Calvin had graciously loaned us $500,000 to start the business with the strict contractual stipulation that he retained a 51% controlling stake in the clinic assets. The lawsuit demanded immediate handover of all clinic operations, bank accounts, and physical property to Calvin to satisfy an alleged breach of contract. My father was claiming we were trying to steal his investment. "This is completely insane," Devin said, dropping the papers onto the kitchen counter. "We never took a loan from them. The clinic is entirely under my name and yours. How can he even file a lawsuit this frivolous without a single piece of evidence?" I flipped to the back of the legal packet and my blood ran ice cold. Attached to the lawsuit as Exhibit A was a promissory note. It detailed a $500,000 transfer from my parents' joint account to a business account. And at the bottom of the page in blue ink were 2 signatures. One belonged to my father. The other was a perfect, flawless replication of Devin's signature. I stared at the blue ink, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. My father had not just sued us, he had committed massive document forgery. He had taken Devin's signature, likely lifted from a Christmas card or an old medical prescription, and had someone professionally trace it onto a fraudulent legal contract. He knew the federal investigators would eventually freeze Spencer assets and seize my parents' home to pay back the stolen money. So Calvin decided to steal my husband's business to create a new source of generational wealth for himself. He wanted to liquidate Devon Lifework to cover Spencer gambling debts. He was going to sacrifice Devon medical career to keep Brielle in designer clothes and maintain his precious country club memberships. They were not just trying to silence me anymore. They were trying to strip us down to nothing and leave us completely destitute. I looked up from the forged signature and met Devon's eyes. The sadness and shock in his gaze were rapidly transforming into the same cold, calculated fury that was currently burning through my own veins. They had pushed the wrong woman, and now they had threatened the wrong man. We stood in the kitchen staring at the forged signature on the lawsuit my father had just served us. Devon did not shout or break anything. His calm was far more terrifying. He traced the copied lines of his own name on the fraudulent document and let out a cold, quiet laugh. "They want my clinic," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "They want the business I built with my own hands to pay off the gambling debts of a white con man they barely know." I took the papers from his hands and placed them carefully back into the manila envelope. I felt a deep, chilling clarity settling over my mind. My parents had crossed the final boundary. They were no longer just enabling a toxic golden child or protecting a fragile social image. They were actively conspiring to steal our livelihood. I looked up at Devin and told him that we were not going to wait for a court date to defend ourselves. We were going to end this tonight. Tonight was the annual spring charity gala hosted by our megachurch. It was the most anticipated social event of the season for the Black upper middle class in Atlanta. The entire congregation would be there wearing custom gowns and tailored suits. It was a night designed for showing off disguised as philanthropy. And this year, the gala chairs were none other than Brielle and Spencer. My parents had undoubtedly orchestrated this to cement Spencer's status as the wealthy white savior of the church community. They needed this public display of extreme generosity to drown out the whispers that were already circulating about the police showing up at their house. They needed everyone to see Spencer writing a massive check, so no one would ever believe he was actually a desperate criminal stealing from his own sister-in-law. I walked upstairs to my home office and opened my encrypted laptop. I had spent the last few days quietly assembling the digital noose that would hang Spencer. Now I just needed to make it public. I downloaded the official Federal Bureau of Investigation asset freeze order that I had secured through my agency contacts. I downloaded the Internal Revenue Service criminal investigation documents that proved Spencer shell companies were currently being dismantled by federal agents. I loaded everything onto a secure black tablet. I did not bother putting on a lavish gown. I chose a tailored black pantsuit, sharp and professional like armor. Devin put on his best dark suit, looking every inch the respected surgeon my father was currently trying to destroy. The drive to the luxury hotel ballroom where the gala was being held took 30 minutes. We did not speak. We did not need to. We pulled into the valet line just as the main dinner service was wrapping up. The timing was deliberate. I knew the schedule of these events by heart. After dinner came the grand pledges, where the wealthiest members of the congregation would publicly announce their donations to the church building fund. We walked through the grand double doors of the ballroom, silently slipping into the shadows near the back wall. No one noticed us. All eyes were glued to the brightly lit stage at the front of the room. The ballroom was decorated in sickeningly opulent tones of gold and white. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over hundreds of guests. My parents sat at the premium center table right up front. My mother was wearing a sequins gown that practically screamed for attention. My father sat beside her, looking incredibly proud, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just committed felony forgery against his own family. And there on the stage stood Brielle and Spencer. Brielle was wearing a glittering silver dress, posing for the event photographers who were stationed around the stage. Spencer held a microphone, looking out at the crowd with that same smug, entitled grin that made my blood boil. The head pastor stood next to them, beaming with admiration as he handed the floor over to Spencer. "We are so incredibly blessed," the pastor announced to the congregation, "to have such generous and faithful leaders in our community. Spencer and Brielle have stepped up in a magnificent way tonight." Spencer took the microphone and cleared his throat, soaking in the adulation. "Thank you, Pastor," he began, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "Brielle and I have always believed that those who are blessed with financial success have a moral obligation to give back. God has been incredibly good to my venture capital firm this year. Despite the challenges we face, sometimes even challenges from troubled individuals within our own extended family, we remain focused on the light." I watched from the back of the room as my mother nodded sympathetically, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She was playing along perfectly, letting the entire congregation know that the troubled individual Spencer was talking about was me. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Spencer continued talking about generational wealth and legacy, throwing around his empty Wall Street buzzwords to impress the crowd. "We believe in the vision of this church," he said, raising his voice dramatically. "And to show our absolute commitment to building up this community, my beautiful wife and I would like to present the building fund with a seed donation to kick off tonight's pledges." Two ushers walked onto the stage, carrying a massive oversized novelty check. The crowd gasped and then broke into thunderous applause. Printed in bold numbers across the giant cardboard check was the amount of $50,000. Brielle posed next to it, resting her hand on Spencer's chest, looking out at the crowd as if she were royalty. My father stood up and started a standing ovation. The entire room got to their feet, clapping and cheering for the wealthy white benefactor and his beautiful black wife, who were supposedly single-handedly funding the new church youth center. I turned to Devin and gave him a single nod. He squeezed my hand and stepped to the side, blocking the view of the nearest security guard. I slipped quietly through the shadows along the side wall, making a direct line for the audio-visual control booth situated at the back corner of the room. The booth was elevated slightly, giving a perfect view of the stage and the massive projector screens hanging on either side of the room. A young teenage volunteer from the church media ministry was sitting at the soundboard wearing headphones and scrolling through his phone. I stepped up into the booth. The teenager looked up startled by my sudden appearance. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice calm and authoritative. "The pastor asked me to load a special presentation slide for the final pledge announcement. I need to plug my tablet directly into the main projector feed." The kid hesitated, looking toward the stage where everyone was still clapping. I am not sure he started to say, but I did not give him time to argue. I pulled out a $50 bill and placed it on the soundboard. "Take a 5-minute break," I told him gently but firmly. The kid looked at the money, looked at my professional demeanor, and shrugged. He took off his headphones, grabbed the cash, and slipped out of the booth. I moved quickly to the control panel. I unplugged the main feed cable from the church laptop and inserted the adapter for my own tablet. I tapped the screen, bringing up the primary file I had prepared. My heart was beating in a steady rhythmic pulse. I felt no fear. I felt absolutely no guilt. I reached out and grabbed the secondary microphone resting on the soundboard, pressing the power switch to activate it. On the stage, the applause was finally dying down. The pastor was shaking Spencer's hand, reaching out to take the giant $50,000 novelty check. Spencer was smiling, soaking in the validation that my parents had bought for him, using my stolen identity. I tapped the screen of my tablet, sending the image directly to the massive projectors on both sides of the ballroom stage. Instantly, the church logo on the screens vanished. The bright, cheerful graphics were replaced by a stark, glaring white document with bold black text and a massive official seal. The entire room went completely silent. People stopped clapping. Hands froze in the air. Heads turned toward the huge screens, trying to process what they were seeing. It was a Federal Bureau of Investigation asset freeze order. The document clearly listed Spencer's full legal name and the names of his 5 fake offshore shell companies. Right below that was an Internal Revenue Service criminal investigation notice detailing active money laundering and wire fraud charges. Spencer turned around to look at the screen. The smug smile literally melted off his face. His jaw went slack and the color drained from his cheeks until he looked entirely ghost white. Brielle dropped her side of the giant novelty check, letting it hit the stage floor with a dull thud. My parents spun around in their premium seats, staring at the projector screens in absolute horror. I lifted the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the high-end speakers, cutting through the dead silence of the ballroom with crystal clarity. "You cannot donate from an account under federal investigation for money laundering, Spencer," I said, my voice ringing with total authority. "That $50,000 check bounced 3 days ago when the feds froze your fake venture capital fund." The sound of my voice over the speaker system was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Hundreds of guests whipped their heads around, trying to find where the voice was coming from. Devin stood tall near the back wall, his arms crossed over his chest, watching my family world completely unravel. On the stage, the pastor instinctively stepped away from Spencer, as if the man were suddenly contagious. The pastor looked at the giant novelty check on the floor and then up at the glaring federal documents projected above them. The bold red letters of the IRS Criminal Division logo were impossible to misinterpret. Spencer grabbed the microphone he was holding, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep it near his mouth. "Turn that off!" he yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic. Turn those screens off right now. This is a mistake. This is a hack. Somebody turn the screens off. But I was standing in the AV booth and I had full control of the system. I tapped my tablet again, and a new document appeared on the massive screens. This one was a detailed bank routing trace showing exactly where Spencer money was really going. It showed the hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing directly into offshore gambling accounts. It showed the crippling debt. It showed the absolute lie that was his entire existence. This is not a hack, Spencer. I spoke evenly into the microphone, letting my calm tone contrast sharply with his frantic screaming. This is forensic accounting. You stood on this stage and talked about generational wealth while secretly draining the accounts of the very people sitting in the front row. You talked about moral obligations while actively stealing the identities of Black women to fund your degenerate gambling addiction. The murmurs in the crowd turned into loud gasps and angry shouts. People who had just been clapping for him were now pointing and demanding answers. Prominent church elders who had invested their own money based on my father's recommendation were standing up from their tables looking furious. My mother Brenda was shrinking into her chair, covering her face with her hands, trying to hide from the burning stares of the women in her social circle. My father Calvin was standing frozen, staring at the screens as the reality of his own foolishness finally became public knowledge. He had forged Devon's signature on a lawsuit to steal a medical clinic, all to protect a man who was publicly humiliating him in front of the entire congregation. Brielle let out a piercing scream. It was not her usual dramatic victim cry. It was a genuine shriek of terror as she watched her carefully constructed reality television lifestyle disintegrate before her eyes. She grabbed Spencer's arm, shaking him. "Do something," she demanded hysterically. "Tell them it is fake, Spencer. Tell them you have the money. Tell them about the Wall Street deals." But Spencer was not looking at her. He was staring at the back doors of the ballroom. His survival instincts were finally kicking in, and he realized that if I had these federal documents, it meant the authorities were already closing the net. He dropped his microphone, let go of Brielle's hand, and actually tried to run. He bolted for the side stairs of the stage, pushing past the pastor in a desperate bid to escape through the kitchen corridors. But the chaos in the room had already reached a boiling point. Men in the congregation, angry investors, and confused guests blocked the aisles. The illusion of the wealthy white savior was dead. He was just a thief running from the truth, and I watched from the booth with a cold, satisfying smile as the room completely imploded around him. The beautiful floral centerpieces on the tables were knocked askew as people pushed their chairs back. Women in expensive gowns were pulling out their phones, recording the screens, recording Spencer trying to flee. Recording my parents sitting in stunned, humiliated silence. The same people who had ostracized me just a few days ago, the same people who had whispered that I was having a mental breakdown, were now realizing they had been completely played by the very family they admired. I stepped out of the AV booth, leaving the tablet connected and the federal documents blazing brightly on the projector screens. I walked slowly down the side aisle toward Devon. The heavy bass of the ambient crowd noise was a symphony of destruction. My parents had told me not to make a scene. They had left cut-up credit cards on my porch and told me to suffer in silence so they could maintain their elite image. They had sued my husband for his life work just to keep their golden child comfortable. They wanted a quiet victim. Instead, they got a forensic investigator who knew exactly how to follow the money and how to burn their fake empire to the very ground. Devon held out his hand as I approached him. His eyes were shining with a fierce pride. We watched the chaos unfold, the screams of my sister, the panicked yelling of my father, the pathetic scrambling of my brother-in-law. It was the most beautiful disaster I had ever seen, and it was only the beginning. The morning after the charity gala, the fallout was absolute and devastating. My father's reputation in the church and the community was completely decimated. The church elders were demanding answers about the missing funds and the embarrassing spectacle that had unfolded on their stage. Instead of feeling any remorse or anger towards Spencer, my father felt only a blinding, toxic rage directed entirely at me. He blamed me for publicly humiliating him and for emasculating his precious son-in-law. Spencer, dangerous underground creditors were now breathing heavily down their necks, demanding immediate payment for the gambling debts. They needed liquid cash urgently to keep the offshore collectors at bay and to prevent the physical threats from becoming a reality. My father sat in his lavish home office and decided that since I had ruined his golden child life, I deserved to be punished in the most severe way possible. He decided to make me completely homeless. Years ago, when Devin and I first bought our modest suburban estate, my father had insisted on reviewing the closing documents. He claimed he simply wanted to offer his expert financial advice to ensure we were getting a good interest rate. What we did not know was that he had secretly kept copies of all our signatures and our property deed. He dug into his files and retrieved those old documents. My father then paid a shadowy contact a significant amount of money to forge a joint deed. The fake document named Calvin as a co-owner of the property, with full rights to liquidate the asset in the event of a family emergency. He used that highly illegal fake deed to secretly sell our house to a sketchy cash for Home's real estate firm. These predatory companies never asked too many questions as long as the paperwork looked passable and the price was incredibly low. He liquidated the roof over my head for a fraction of its worth just to get a bag of quick cash to pay for Spencer criminal mistakes. While my father was busy selling my house out from under me, Spencer was taking his own desperate and violent measures. He knew the Federal Bureau of Investigation was closing in rapidly. His bank accounts were frozen, and his passport was likely already flagged by international authorities. He thought if he could just destroy the physical evidence I had compiled against him, he might somehow have a chance to escape federal prison. He knew I kept heavily encrypted physical backups of all the financial tracking data in a secure safe at Devon Medical Clinic. That afternoon, Devon was finishing up his patient charts in his private office. The clinic was normally a peaceful place dedicated to healing and physical therapy. That peace was shattered when three large, imposing men walked through the front doors. They wore heavy jackets and had the unmistakable demeanor of hired muscle. They pushed past the terrified receptionist, locking the heavy glass doors behind them and flipping the open sign to closed. They marched directly down the hallway and kicked the door to Devon office open. The lead thug, a massive man with a scarred face, cornered Devon behind his wooden desk. He slammed his fists down on the desktop, sending pens and patient files scattering to the floor. The man demanded that Devon open the wall safe and hand over the hard drives. He leaned over the desk, getting right in Devon's face, and told my husband that if he did not force me to drop the federal case, they would break every single finger on both of his hands. They threatened to shatter his bones so completely that he would never be able to hold a scalpel or perform surgery ever again. They vastly underestimated the man I married. Spencer hired thugs thought they were dealing with a soft suburban doctor who would cower at the first sign of physical intimidation. Devon is a highly trained trauma surgeon. He spends every single working day saving lives by intimately understanding every nerve, bone, muscle, and pressure point in the human body. He did not panic. He did not raise his voice or beg for mercy. Devon stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible and his expression completely blank. When the lead thug grew impatient and lunged forward trying to grab Devon by the collar of his scrubs, Devon moved with terrifying and calculated precision. He fluidly sidestepped the heavy, clumsy blow, using the massive man-own forward momentum against him. With two swift and incredibly precise strikes to a major nerve cluster in the attacker's shoulder, Devon paralyzed the man's entire right arm. Before the thug could even register the shock, Devon applied a brutal anatomical joint lock, twisting the man's wrist and elbow into a position that forced him straight to his knees. Devon had the massive leader immobilized on the office floor, screaming in blinding agony within 3 seconds flat. The other two hired muscle froze completely, shocked by how quickly and clinically their boss had been dismantled by a doctor in scrubs. Devon kept the pressure on the joint lock and calmly picked up his desk phone with his free hand. He dialed emergency services reporting a break-in and an assault. He then looked at the two standing men, his voice deadpan and authoritative. He told them to sit down on the waiting room chairs and stay perfectly still until the police arrived, or he would gladly demonstrate how many bones he could systematically dislocate. The men sat down like obedient children, terrified of the calm surgeon standing over their whimpering leader. Devon stood guard over the safe, protecting my evidence while the police sirens wailed in the distance. I was entirely unaware of the violence unfolding at the medical clinic. I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking a cup of green tea and finalizing the very last batch of financial documents to send to the federal prosecutor. The house was quiet and peaceful. That quiet was suddenly shattered by a violent, aggressive pounding on my front door. It was not a normal knock. It sounded like someone was using a heavy fist trying to break the solid wood door right off its hinges. I jumped up from my stool, my heart instantly racing. I walked cautiously to the foyer and looked through the narrow glass side panels next to the door. There were 4 men standing on my porch. They were wearing heavy work boots, cargo pants, and matching polo shirts with a commercial real estate company logo embroidered on the chest. I opened the door just a few inches, keeping the heavy metal chain lock firmly engaged. The man standing in the front held up a thick clipboard covered in official-looking county stamps and legal seals. He looked at me with bored, tired indifference and told me I had exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises. He spoke in a monotone voice explaining that the property had been sold in an expedited fast cash transaction earlier that morning. He said the new corporate owners were taking immediate physical possession of the estate and that I was officially trespassing. I stared at the eviction notice clamped to his clipboard in absolute disbelief. I told the man there had to be a massive mistake because my husband and I owned this home and we had never put it on the market. The man sighed heavily and flipped to the second page of the packet, pressing it up against the crack in the door so I could read it. My eyes scanned the legal jargon until they hit the seller's signature line. The name printed in bold black ink was Calvin Wilson. My own father had actually sold my home to a predatory investment firm using forged documents. He had stolen the roof over my head just to secure cash for a criminal. The lead eviction officer tapped his pen against the clipboard. He told me that if I did not unchain the door and begin moving my personal belongings out to the curb immediately, they would call the county sheriff to have me forcefully and physically removed from the property. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I tried to process the sheer scale and depth of my family evil. I pushed the door closed for a moment, telling the men I needed to make a phone call. My hands were shaking as I reached into my pocket to call Devon. As I walked toward the large bay window in the living room to get a better cell phone signal, I saw something outside that made my blood run entirely cold. Parked directly across the street from my house was a familiar leased luxury car. Brielle was standing on the public sidewalk right in front of my beautifully manicured lawn. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding her smartphone up high. The phone was mounted on a small portable tripod with a bright ring light attached to it. She was live streaming. I watched in horror as my sister smiled brightly into her camera lens. She was actively broadcasting to her massive social media following and to the entire church congregation. She was spinning a horrific fabricated story, telling her viewers that she was doing a live broadcast to expose the truth about her deeply troubled sister. She was narrating the scene, claiming that I had squandered my finances and lost my mind, and was now being rightfully evicted from a home I could no longer afford. She was smiling, pointing her camera directly at my front door, waiting with eager anticipation to film me being thrown out into the street by angry men in work boots. She wanted to destroy my dignity in real time for social media clout, while her husband tried to destroy my husband at the clinic. They wanted a complete annihilation of our lives. I watched her for a moment, letting the sheer absurdity of the situation wash over me. Brielle was shivering slightly in the damp, cool air outside, but she kept that bright artificial smile plastered on her face, performing for an audience of complete strangers. She was so desperate for validation, so hungry for the approval of the church gossips and the social media elite, that she was willing to stand in the pouring rain just to broadcast my supposed downfall. She thought she was directing a tragedy, but she had no idea she was actually starring in a live documentary about her own family demise. While my father was busy trying to sell my house out from under me, Spencer was taking his own desperate and violent measures across town. He knew the Federal Bureau of Investigation was closing in rapidly. His bank accounts were entirely frozen, and his passport was likely already flagged by international authorities. He thought if he could just destroy the physical evidence I had compiled against him, he might somehow have a fighting chance to escape federal prison. He knew I kept heavily encrypted physical backups of all the financial tracking data in a secure wall safe at Devon Medical Clinic. Earlier that afternoon, Devon had been finishing up his patient charts in his private office. The clinic was normally a peaceful place dedicated to healing and physical therapy. That peace was violently shattered when three large, imposing men walked through the front doors. They wore heavy jackets and had the unmistakable aggressive demeanor of hired muscle. They pushed past the terrified receptionist, locking the heavy glass doors behind them and flipping the open sign to closed. As Devon recounted to me later, they marched directly down the hallway and kicked the door to his office open. The lead thug, a massive man with a scarred face, cornered Devon behind his wooden desk. He slammed his fists down on the desktop, sending pens and patient files scattering to the floor. The man demanded that Devon open the wall safe and hand over the hard drives containing the IRS and FBI files. He leaned over the desk, getting right in Devon's face, and told my husband that if he did not force me to drop the federal case, they would break every single finger on both of his hands. They threatened to shatter his bones so completely that he would never be able to hold a scalpel or perform surgery ever again. They vastly underestimated the man I married. Spencer-hired thugs thought they were dealing with a soft suburban doctor who would cower at the first sign of physical intimidation. Devon is a highly trained trauma surgeon. He spends every single working day saving lives by intimately understanding every nerve, bone, muscle, and pressure point in the human body. He did not panic. He did not raise his voice or beg for mercy. Devon stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible and his expression completely blank. When the lead thug grew impatient and lunged forward, trying to grab Devon by the collar of his scrubs, Devon moved with terrifying and calculated precision. He fluidly sidestepped the heavy, clumsy blow, using the massive man-own forward momentum against him. With two swift and incredibly precise strikes to a major nerve cluster in the attacker's shoulder, Devon completely paralyzed the man's entire right arm. Before the thug could even register the shock, Devon applied a brutal anatomical joint lock, twisting the man's wrist and elbow into a position that forced him straight to his knees. Devon had the massive leader immobilized on the office floor, screaming in blinding agony within 3 seconds flat. The other two hired muscles froze completely, shocked by how quickly and clinically their boss had been dismantled by a doctor in scrubs. Devon kept the heavy physical pressure on the joint lock and calmly picked up his desk phone with his free hand. He dialed emergency services, reporting a break-in and an assault. He then looked at the two standing men, his voice deadpan and authoritative. He told them to sit down on the waiting room chairs and stay perfectly still until the police arrived, or he would gladly demonstrate exactly how many bones he could systematically dislocate. The men sat down like obedient children, terrified of the calm surgeon standing over their whimpering leader. Devon stood guard over the safe, protecting my evidence, while the police sirens wailed in the distance. Back at our estate, the aggressive pounding on my front door continued. I turned away from the window where I had been watching Brielle live stream and walked toward the foyer. The eviction team was demanding entry. I unchained the heavy front door and pulled it wide open. The lead eviction officer looked surprised, expecting me to be barricaded inside or hysterically crying on the floor. He had his heavy boot positioned near the threshold, ready to force his way in. Instead, I stepped aside and gestured for the four large men to enter my home. "Come on in," I said, my voice perfectly level and polite. "Please wipe your boots on the mat as it is raining quite heavily out there, and I just had these hardwood floors polished." The men exchanged confused glances. They were used to screaming matches, tearful pleas, and chaotic physical removals. They were not used to being welcomed inside like formal dinner guests. They stepped over the threshold, wiping their feet awkwardly on the welcome mat. Outside, through the open doorway, I could see Brielle shifting her phone on its portable tripod, stretching her neck trying to get a better angle to capture my breakdown. I looked right at the camera lens, gave a small polite wave, and closed the heavy front door, shutting her out in the rain. I led the eviction team into the formal dining room and gestured toward the large oak table. The house was completely serene, filled with the soft scent of eucalyptus and lavender. I was just brewing a fresh pot of green tea. I offered smoothly, turning to look at the four burly men standing uncomfortably in my pristine dining room. "Would any of you care for a cup before we get down to the business of you trying to throw me out of my own home?" The lead officer cleared his throat, looking incredibly uncomfortable with my calm hospitality. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, adjusting his grip on his clipboard. We are not here for tea?" he said, his voice gruff but lacking its earlier aggression. "We are here to execute a lawful transfer of commercial property and take immediate physical possession. The new owners have authorized us to secure the premises. You need to start packing your personal items immediately, or we will be forced to call the county sheriff to have you physically removed for trespassing." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply smiled and walked over to my home office, returning a moment later, not with moving boxes or garbage bags, but with a large, rolled-up architectural blueprint and a sleek black leather folder. I walked back to the dining room table and unrolled the blueprint across the smooth wooden surface, using two heavy crystal coasters to hold the curling edges down flat. It was a highly detailed county zoning and parcel map from 10 years ago, complete with surveyor stamps and official municipal watermarks. "I understand you are just doing your job, gentlemen," I told the men as they cautiously gathered around the table to look at the map. "You were handed a piece of paper and told to secure an asset. But I think the predatory real estate firm you represent has made a rather expensive and frankly embarrassing mistake today." I opened the black leather folder and pulled out a certified copy of the property deed they had brought with them. It was the exact document my father Calvin Wilson had forged and sold for quick cash. I tapped my manicured finger on the parcel identification number, printed at the very top of my fraudulent document. "You see this parcel number right here," I said, looking up at the lead officer who was now leaning over the table with a deep frown. "This deed belongs to a small, single-story ranch house that sat on this exact plot of land over a decade ago. My father helped me negotiate the mortgage rate for that specific small structure when Devin and I were just starting out and building our credit. He insisted on keeping copies of all those old closing files for his own records because he always needed to feel like he was in control of our finances. He used those old, outdated documents to forge a joint deed claiming he was a co-owner of my property. He then sold that fake deed to your firm this morning to get a massive influx of cash to pay off his son-in-law offshore gambling debts." The officers frowned, leaning in closer to study the documents. Their aggressive posture was completely gone, replaced by a creeping sense of professional dread. What my father neglected to realize. I continued pulling out a second, much thicker stack of legally binding papers from the black folder, is that Devin and I demolished that small ranch house 5 years ago. We completely rezoned the property. We merged it with the 2 empty lots adjacent to us, and we built this luxury suburban estate from the ground up using our own money. I laid the real active property deed on the table, right next to the forged one they had brought. "This current estate, the one you are standing inside right now, is registered under a completely new commercial parcel number. And it is not owned by Kiera or Devin. It was purchased with 100% cash and is exclusively owned by a private limited liability company which I fully and solely control." The lead officer picked up the real deed, his eyes scanning the corporate registration, the fresh county seals, the tax records, and the irrefutable proof of unencumbered corporate ownership. His face drained of color as he realized his firm had just paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in a shady fast cash transaction for a piece of paper that legally bound them to a demolished house that no longer existed. They had bypassed standard title insurance and thorough inspections to get a cheap deal, and instead they had bought a ghost. "Ma'am," he stammered, setting the paper back down on the table as if it were burning his fingers. "If this is true, then the deed we bought from Calvin Wilson is completely worthless. It does not give us any right to this property or the structures on it. It is highly fraudulent," I corrected him gently but firmly, "which means your firm is now the victim of a massive federal wire fraud and illegal property transfer perpetrated by my father. You just handed $500,000 to a desperate man based on documents he fabricated in his home office. I suggest you call your corporate lawyers immediately and tell them to freeze whatever accounts they wired that money to, because you are absolutely not evicting anyone from this property today or any other day." The four men looked at each other in stunned silence, realizing the massive legal nightmare they had just walked blindly into. They were no longer dealing with a helpless woman being kicked out of her home. They were dealing with a federal financial investigator who had just caught their company participating in a major real estate scam. The lead officer slowly picked up his clipboard and took a large step back from the table. "We apologize for the intrusion, ma." He said, his tone entirely respectful and deeply apologetic. "We will be leaving now and contacting our legal department." I walked them back to the foyer and opened the front door. The rain was still pouring down. Brielle was still standing on the sidewalk, huddled under a small umbrella, holding her phone and narrating to her live stream. She perked up when she saw the door open, expecting to see me being dragged out in tears. Instead, she saw the four large men walking out with their heads down, looking defeated and panicked. I stood in the doorway, watching her face contort in absolute confusion as the eviction team climbed back into their trucks and drove away without me. I closed the door and walked back into the dining room just as Devin walked through the kitchen entrance from the garage. He shook the rain from his dark jacket, looking completely unbothered after handing 3 violent thugs over to the local police. He looked at the blueprints on the table and then looked at me, a small, proud smile playing on his lips. "Are they gone?" he asked, walking over to wrap his arm around my waist. "They are gone," I replied, leaning into his strong embrace. "And so is my father, Leverage. My father thought he could render me homeless to punish me for exposing his golden boy. He thought he could strip away my safety and my sanctuary. He did not realize that while he was busy forging old documents, I had been legally dismantling his entire empire. To keep up appearances and to continuously fund Brielle and Spencer, extravagant lifestyle, Calvin and Brenda had quietly taken out multiple reverse mortgages on their massive suburban estate. When Spencer gambling debts caught up with them, they missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments. The bank holding the primary note on their sprawling estate had quietly pushed the property into pre-foreclosure status. My father had desperately sold my fake deed this morning specifically to get the cash needed to stop the foreclosure on his own home. But I tracked bad debt for a living. I saw the pre-foreclosure notice hit the banking registry 3 days ago. Devin and I had lived well below our means for years, choosing to build massive private wealth. I had my legal team contact the primary lien holder directly. Banks hate holding distressed luxury properties and prefer to offload the bad debt to private cash buyers. I simply formed a secondary holding company and offered to buy the entire defaulted mortgage portfolio for my parents' estate outright. The bank agreed immediately, and the transaction cleared the federal wire system at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. I reached into the very back of the black leather folder and pulled out one final document printed on heavy ivory stock paper with raised notary seals. I slid it slowly across the polished dining table so Devin could read it. "My house was never actually sold," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded total attention in the quiet room. But my parents' generational home, the one they bled dry to protect a criminal, was just sold at a quiet commercial bank auction this morning. Devin looked down at the new paper, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he read the corporate transfer seals. I turned to look out the bay window, watching Brielle slowly pack up her ring light and tripod in the pouring rain, completely humiliated in front of her live stream audience. "And the private LLC that just bought their defaulted mortgage from the bank," I said, taking a slow, deliberate breath, "is mine." Devin was still staring at the ivory paper when the violent pounding began on our front door. It was not the measured professional knock of the eviction officers. It was the desperate, chaotic banging of people who had just realized their entire world was collapsing. My parents had clearly driven straight from the charity gala to my house, bringing Brielle and Spencer with them. They thought they could intimidate me into undoing what I had just done. Devin looked at me, and I nodded. I told him to let them in and lead them straight back to my home office. It was time for them to see exactly how I had dismantled their lives. I walked down the hall and opened the double doors to my office. The room was bathed in the cool light of my computer monitors. Covering the massive mahogany conference table in the center of the room were dozens of financial flow charts, bank statements, and wire transfer logs. I had spent hours pinning every single document to the large corkboard on the wall, connecting the dots with red string like a detective building a murder board. Because that is exactly what this was. A murder board for Spencer Fake Empire. My family stormed into the room like a hurricane. My mother Brenda was shrieking, her designer gown ruined by the rain, her hair a wet, tangled mess. My father Calvin was red in the face, pointing his finger and yelling about how I was a disgrace to the family name. Brielle was sobbing, clutching her expensive purse like a shield. And then there was Spencer. Despite having his money laundering exposed on a 50-foot screen at the church gala, he still wore that sickeningly arrogant smirk. He walked into my office, adjusting his custom-tailored suit jacket, looking around at my computer screens with absolute disdain. "You think you are so smart," Kiera Spencer said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think printing out a few fake documents and ruining a church service makes you a financial genius. You are just an accountant. You punch numbers into a calculator. You have absolutely no idea what venture capital restructuring looks like." I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked over to the massive corkboard on my wall and turned on the overhead display lights. The sheer volume of data illuminated in the room made my father stop yelling mid-sentence. "I am not just an accountant, Spencer," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I am a senior forensic financial investigator. And over the last 48 hours, I have completely reverse-engineered your entire criminal network." I tapped a long wooden pointer against a cluster of documents pinned to the left side of the board. "Let us start with your so-called venture capital firm. You do not have a registered investment portfolio. What you have is a nesting doll structure of 5 ghost limited liability companies." I moved the pointer, tracking the red string connecting the corporate names. "You registered the first shell company in Delaware, using a registered agent service to hide your identity. You used that Delaware company to open a second entity in the Bahamas. Then you layered 3 more phantom companies in the Cayman Islands, creating a circular ownership structure designed to obscure the original source of funds. It is a classic money laundering technique used by amateur cartels and desperate gamblers. You thought burying the paper trail under 5 layers of international corporate filings would make you invisible." Spencer's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, crossing his arms over his chest. "Anyone can look up public corporate registries, Kiera," he sneered. "That does not prove anything." "You are right," I replied smoothly, moving to the center of the board. "Public registries only show the shell. The real magic is following the cash flow." And that is where my mother came in. I looked directly at Brenda, who was suddenly looking very pale. "Spencer needed seed money to make his fake companies look legitimate," I explained to the quiet room. "But his credit was completely destroyed from years of underground sports betting. He could not get a loan from a traditional bank to save his life. So he convinced my status-obsessed parents that he was on the verge of a $1 billion tech buyout and just needed a temporary bridge loan. But my parents did not have the liquid cash he needed, so my mother willingly stole my social security number. My father gasped, turning to look at Brenda. "You told me Kiera agreed to co-sign the loan," he whispered. "She did not just forge my signature, Dad," I said, keeping my eyes locked on my mother. "She used her intimate knowledge of my life to bypass the identity verification questions on the bank portals. She knew my first childhood street address. She knew the make and model of my very first car. She knew my maternal grandmother's maiden name. She sat at her computer in your perfect suburban house and systematically answered every security question necessary to open $400,000 worth of premium credit lines in my name. She willingly committed felony identity theft against her own flesh and blood, so she could brag to her church friends about her wealthy white son-in-law." Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stared at the floor, trembling. I turned my attention back to Spencer. "Once my mother secured the fraudulent funds for you, Spencer, you immediately began moving the cash. You transferred the entire $400,000 into the Delaware Shell Company. From there, you broke the money down into dozens of smaller transactions, each one falling just under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold. It is a technique called smurfing. You thought if you kept the transfers small, the banking algorithms would not flag them for suspicious activity." I walked over to my desk and picked up my encrypted tablet. "But you clearly do not understand how modern forensic auditing actually works. I do not sit at a desk with a calculator. I use proprietary artificial intelligence data mining software designed to track international terror funding. I fed your primary bank routing numbers into our network algorithm. The AI cross-referenced every single microtransaction you made over the last 6 months, matching timestamp anomalies and IP address pings across global financial networks. It took my software exactly 48 hours to collapse your entire phantom empire." I tapped the tablet screen, sending a new detailed flowchart to the large monitor mounted above my desk. It showed the exact flow of the stolen money. The software tracked your Smurf transactions from Delaware to the Bahamas. From the Bahamas, the money was funneled into the 3 Cayman Island accounts. And from the Cayman Islands, every single penny was wired directly into unregulated offshore gambling syndicates. You did not invest a single dime into a startup. You literally gambled away $400,000 of stolen money playing high-stakes baccarat and illegal sports books. The silence in my office was absolute. The evidence was laid out with terrifying surgical precision. Every lie, every forged signature, every hidden transfer was exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Brielle was staring at the monitor, her jaw hanging open as the reality of her husband's criminal behavior finally pierced her thick bubble of delusion. My father was leaning heavily against the doorframe, looking like he might physically collapse. He had sold my home using a forged deed and ruined his reputation at the church, all to protect a man who had gambled away his daughter's future on a card game. I looked at Spencer. He was cornered. His Wall Street vocabulary and expensive suits could not protect him from the undeniable forensic data pinned to my wall. The gig was up, and he knew it. But instead of apologizing, instead of begging for mercy, Spencer did the only thing a true narcissist knows how to do when they are caught. He went on the attack. Spencer threw his head back and let out a loud, arrogant laugh. It was a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. He looked at the intricate flowcharts, and then looked at me, shaking his head with absolute condescension. "You really went all out for this little presentation? Did not you, Kiera?" he said, stepping closer to me, his voice dropping into a sneer. "You spent hours connecting strings on a corkboard like a crazy person in a basement. But let us be entirely realistic for a second. You are nobody. You are just a bitter, vindictive woman who works in a cubicle. I am a respected businessman with connections all over this city. I have lawyers on retainer who eat people like you for breakfast." He leaned in dangerously close, his eyes narrowing with a toxic mix of misogyny and racial superiority. "Do you really think the feds are going to believe an angry black woman over a businessman like me? They are going to look at your little corkboard and they are going to laugh you right out of the building. They will see this for exactly what it is, a jealous sister throwing a psychotic tantrum because she cannot handle being the loser of the family. You can keep your fake flowcharts, Kiera. Tomorrow morning, my lawyers will have this entire thing swept under the rug, and you will be facing a massive defamation lawsuit. Devin took a step forward, his fists clenched, ready to physically remove Spencer from our home. But I held up my hand, stopping him. I did not need Devin to defend me. I was holding all the cards, and Spencer had absolutely no idea the magnitude of the trap he was standing in. I looked Spencer dead in the eye and let a slow, relaxed smile spread across my face. "You are absolutely right, Spencer," I said, my voice soft and calm. "The feds probably would not care about a simple domestic dispute over stolen credit cards. They have bigger fish to fry. Identity theft happens every day, and maybe your expensive lawyers could spin a narrative about a family misunderstanding to keep you out of handcuffs." I took a step closer, matching his arrogant posture. "That is exactly why I did not just call the FBI," I whispered. "I called the IRS." Spencer's eyes flickered, his confident smirk faltering slightly. "I did not report you for stealing my identity," I continued, my voice picking up strength. "I reported you for tax evasion and undeclared offshore income. You see, when you set up those 5 ghost companies, you forgot to file the foreign bank and financial accounts forms with the Treasury Department. When you funneled that $400,000 through the Cayman Islands to hide it from your creditors, you created a massive unreported tax liability. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division does not care about your pedigree, Spencer. They do not care about your custom suits or your country club connections. And they certainly do not care about your racist assumptions regarding who they will believe." I picked up a heavy sealed folder from my desk and tossed it onto the table right in front of him. "The FBI might have let your lawyers negotiate a plea deal," I said, watching the sheer terror finally wash over his face. "But the IRS does not negotiate with tax evaders who launder money through international shell companies. They sent agents to your virtual offices in Delaware this morning. They seized the servers hosting your Cayman Island accounts this afternoon. And while you were standing on that church stage writing fake charity checks to impress my parents, the IRS officially filed federal tax fraud charges against you." Spencer stumbled backward, bumping into the heavy leather chair. He looked at the folder on the table as if it were a venomous snake. His chest was heaving, his breathing shallow and rapid. The realization that his arrogant white privilege could not shield him from the IRS was finally shattering his reality. "They are not coming to listen to an angry black woman," I said, my voice ringing with total absolute finality. "They are coming to audit your entire life. And they are going to take everything." Spencer did not say another word. The blood had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had walked into my office just 10 minutes prior. He grabbed Brielle by the arm, pulling her roughly toward the door. She stumbled on her designer heels, crying out in confusion, but he did not stop to comfort her. His survival instinct had taken over, and his only thought was escaping the room before the walls completely closed in on him. My parents followed blindly behind them. My father was leaning heavily on my mother, his breathing shallow and erratic. They had walked into my home expecting to bully me into submission, and instead they had walked straight into a federal forensic trap. I stood beside Devin and watched the 4 of them scramble down the hallway and out the front door. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, sealing them out in the cold rain. Over the next 48 hours, I barely left my computer monitors. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division moves with a terrifying and absolute efficiency. I watched the digital shockwaves ripple through Spencer's fake empire. His domestic accounts were frozen solid. His offshore routing numbers were flagged and seized. He was completely cut off from the global financial system. But rats like Spencer are incredibly dangerous when they are cornered. He knew he was facing decades in federal prison for tax evasion and wire fraud. He also knew that his underground gambling creditors were still hunting him. He needed liquid cash, and he needed it immediately so he could secure a fake passport and flee to a non-extradition country. I tracked his frantic digital footprint as he desperately tried to pivot. He maxed out the very last of Brielle personal credit cards to book the grand ballroom at the most expensive five-star hotel in the city. He sent out frantic emergency digital invitations to a massive 5-year anniversary gala. But the guest list told me everything I needed to know about his true motive. He did not invite friends or family. He invited a highly targeted list of foreign investors and overseas venture capitalists who were completely unaware of his current legal nightmare. He was setting up a massive pump and dump exit scam. He planned to use the lavish anniversary party as a glittering facade to pitch a fake next-generation tech startup. His goal was to con these wealthy overseas marks into wiring millions of dollars in liquid cash directly into an untraceable crypto wallet so he could vanish into the night. The absolute worst part of his plan was how he continued to use my parents as human props in his pathetic theater. My father and mother were terrified of losing their generational home. They knew I held the defaulted mortgage, and they knew I was entirely, completely serious about foreclosing on them. Spencer fed their delusion. He promised them that this anniversary gala was actually a cover for a mega deal. He told my father that he was about to secure a massive buyout and that he would pay off their mortgage the very next morning. My parents bought the lie completely hook, line, and sinker. They were so desperate to believe in the illusion of their wealthy son-in-law that they emptied the very last pennies of their retirement savings. They drained their final 401k accounts just to buy ridiculously expensive luxury outfits for the gala. They bought a custom tuxedo and a glittering designer gown they could not afford, blindly believing that playing the part of wealthy in-laws would somehow save them from absolute ruin. Spencer was terrified that I would show up and ruin his final con. He hired private security for the hotel ballroom and explicitly put my name and Devin's name on a banned list. He gave the guards our photographs and told them to arrest us for trespassing if we even stepped foot on the property. He thought he had completely locked me out of his final desperate performance. But Spencer always underestimated the silent power of true earned respect. Devin did not need to break down doors or cause a public scene to get inside. Devin is one of the most elite and respected trauma surgeons in the entire state. He saves lives every single day. His former patients include city council members, judges, and billionaire philanthropists. Devin simply made one quiet phone call to the chairman of his hospital board, who also happened to be a major investor in the very luxury hotel where the gala was being held. The chairman made exactly one phone call to the hotel general manager. Within 30 minutes, a private courier arrived at our front door holding a velvet box containing 2 all-access VVIP lanyards. We did not just have entry to the gala. We had unrestricted access to the private upper balconies, the service corridors, and the secure meeting rooms. I spent the evening getting ready with a cold, meticulous focus. I chose a sharp, tailored crimson suit that fit me perfectly. It was not a dress designed for dancing. It was armor designed for an execution. Devin wore a pristine black suit, looking every inch the powerful and respected man my family had desperately tried to destroy. We drove to the 5-star hotel in silence. The building was a towering monument to excess situated in the wealthiest district of the city. Valet parking was a chaotic sea of luxury cars and expensive sports utility vehicles. We bypassed the main entrance completely. Using our VVIP lanyards, we entered through a private subterranean elevator reserved for high-profile dignitaries. We stepped out onto the mezzanine level, which featured a wraparound balcony looking directly down onto the grand ballroom. The scale of the financial waste was absolutely sickening. Spencer had blown hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen credit on a fake celebration. There were massive ice sculptures carved into the shape of swans melting slowly under the warm chandeliers. There were champagne towers stacked 10 tiers high with waiters in white gloves pouring expensive vintage wine. A live jazz orchestra played softly in the corner, trying to create an atmosphere of old money and sophisticated wealth. I looked down at the crowd and immediately spotted my parents. They were standing near the main bar, trying desperately to look like they belonged. My father was wearing a stiff, uncomfortable tuxedo that clearly did not fit his current stress-inflated waistline. My mother was wearing a sequins gown that caught the light in a desperate plea for attention. They were smiling and holding champagne flutes, but their eyes were darting around the room with pure naked panic. They were drowning in debt, their home was gone, their reputation was dead, and yet they were still holding on to the empty shell of their social status. Brielle was floating through the crowd wearing a custom white silk dress that probably cost more than my first car. She was clinging to Spencer's arm, laughing loudly, and tossing her hair, playing the role of the adoring wealthy wife. But Spencer looked terrible. From the balcony, I could see the heavy sheen of sweat coating his forehead. His eyes were manic and darting, tracking every single foreign investor in the room. He was pacing like a caged animal, forcing loud laughter and aggressively shaking hands. He was running out of time, and the desperation was literally seeping out of his pores. Devin stood behind me, resting his warm hands gently on my shoulders. We watched from the shadows of the balcony as Spencer finally made his move. He cornered a small group of highly influential overseas venture capitalists near a private seating area away from the loud music. These were men who managed sovereign wealth funds and private equity portfolios. Spencer gestured for them to follow him toward a set of heavy mahogany doors that led to a private VVIP meeting room just off the main ballroom floor. He pulled Brielle along with him, needing her to play the supportive spouse to close the emotional side of the con. My parents trailed behind them like desperate puppies, hoping to catch the scraps of the financial miracle Spencer had promised them. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind them. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked the encrypted tracking application. I had been coordinating quietly with my contacts at the federal level all evening. I tapped a single message confirming the target was isolated in the private room. I looked up at Devin and he gave me a slow, steady nod. It was time to end the charade permanently. We walked purposefully down the grand, sweeping staircase from the mezzanine, our footsteps completely silent against the thick, plush carpeting. We moved through the crowded ballroom, navigating around the ice sculptures and the oblivious, wealthy guests who were drinking champagne funded by stolen money. We reached the hallway leading to the private meeting rooms. The private security guards Spencer had hired saw us approaching. They reached for their radios, recognizing our faces from the banned list. But before they could even lift the radios to their mouths, the heavy glass doors of the hotel main entrance violently swung open. The smooth jazz music in the ballroom was instantly drowned out by the heavy coordinated sound of tactical boots hitting the marble floor. The entire room froze in absolute terror as a massive, heavily armed federal strike team flooded into the gala. These were not local police officers responding to a noise complaint. These were elite federal agents wearing dark tactical gear with the bold yellow letters of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the United States Federal Marshals printed across their tactical vests. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute authority, securing every single exit and locking down the perimeter within seconds. The private security guards backed away against the wall, raising their hands in complete surrender as the federal agents surged past them. I stepped to the center of the hallway, and Devin stood beside me, our presence a calm anchor in the middle of the unfolding chaos. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing woman with a badge hanging from her neck, recognized me immediately. She gave me a sharp professional nod and signaled for her team to stack up outside the heavy mahogany doors of the private meeting room. Inside that room, Spencer was in the middle of his final, desperate performance. Through the thick wood, I could hear his muffled voice, making grand promises about proprietary algorithms and guaranteed exponential returns. He was selling them a ghost. He was selling them the exact same lies he had used to destroy my family. I could picture him laying the fraudulent contracts on the table, sliding the expensive fountain pen across the polished wood, pointing to the signature line that would authorize a $5 million wire transfer to his offshore crypto wallet. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully outsmarted the system and secured his golden ticket out of the country. The pen was literally hovering over the paper. I did not bother knocking. I reached out and pushed both of the heavy mahogany doors open with a violent shove. The doors slammed against the interior walls with a deafening crack that echoed through the private room. Spencer Head snapped up his hand, freezing midair. The foreign investors jumped back in their leather chairs, startled by the explosive intrusion. Brielle let out a sharp, terrified gasp. My parents spun around, dropping their champagne glasses onto the thick carpet. I walked slowly into the center of the room with Devin right beside me. Behind us, the doorway was completely blocked by a dozen heavily armed federal agents, their tactical gear stark and terrifying against the luxury of the hotel meeting room. The lead agent stepped forward, her hand resting firmly on her utility belt. Spencer's face completely collapsed. The color drained from his skin, leaving him looking like a terrified, sickly ghost. The expensive fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered uselessly onto the fraudulent $5 million contract. The illusion was entirely dead. There was nowhere left to run. No more lies to spin. No more credit cards to steal. The absolute weight of federal justice had finally arrived, and I stood in the center of the room watching his fake empire crumble into absolute dust. Brielle let out a piercing shriek that shattered the dead silence of the private meeting room. The sound was shrill and desperate, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings and crystal fixtures. She pointed a violently shaking finger at me, her face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic rage. She screamed for the hotel security, demanding they throw me out immediately. She yelled that I was trespassing, that I was a jealous, deranged woman trying to ruin her perfect 5-year anniversary gala. She stamped her foot on the expensive carpet, demanding that someone remove the angry, bitter sister who was interrupting her husband's billion-dollar moment. The hotel guards who had followed us down the corridor hesitated. They took one look at the heavily armed men standing behind Devin and me, and they immediately backed away against the walls, shrinking into the shadows. I did not wait for anyone to respond to her frantic screaming. I did not flinch or break eye contact with the room. I walked straight past the trembling hotel staff and moved directly toward the small presentation stage where Spencer had set up his pitch. I walked up the 2 short steps, my tailored crimson suit acting as a shield of absolute authority. Spencer was frozen, his hand hovering over the fraudulent $5 million investment contract. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickeningly weak. I reached out and firmly took the microphone from the podium. I did not pull out a projector. I did not cue up a slick video presentation or hand out printed packets of forensic evidence. I did not need visual aids to dismantle a ghost. I stood on that stage and looked directly at the wealthy overseas venture capitalists sitting around the heavy mahogany table. I spoke into the microphone, my voice calm even and ringing with terrifying clarity. I simply recited a single offshore bank routing number. I read the 12 digits slowly, deliberately, letting each individual number hang in the heavy air of the room. As soon as the translators relayed those specific numbers into the earpieces of the foreign investors, the entire dynamic of the room collapsed. The wealthy marks dropped their expensive pens onto the table. The gold-plated nibs clattered loudly against the wood. They pushed their heavy leather chairs back from the table, as if the contracts sitting in front of them had suddenly burst into flames. They recognized that routing number immediately. It was the exact offshore account Spencer had instructed them to wire their millions into. It was the account he claimed belonged to his revolutionary new tech startup. I looked down at the investors and told them the absolute truth. I told them that specific account had just been seized by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division less than an hour ago. I explained that it was not a corporate holding account, but a crypto laundering wallet tied directly to illegal sports betting and international wire fraud. The translators whispered frantically into their ears, explaining the sudden, terrifying shift in the room. The foreign investors immediately stood up, buttoning their suit jackets and stepping far away from Spencer as if he were suddenly radioactive. Spencer's survival instinct finally kicked in, but he was completely trapped in a corner of his own making. He slammed his hands down on the podium and tried to laugh. It was a pathetic, desperate sound that carried absolutely no weight. He grabbed the spare microphone and tried to regain control of the room. He told the investors that I was just a disgruntled family member having a mental breakdown. He pointed at me and threw a racist microaggression directly into the microphone, his voice dripping with venom and cornered panic. He asked the investors if they were really going to believe an angry black woman over a respected businessman with old money lineage like him. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his white privilege as a final shield against the reality closing in around him. I smiled at him. A slow, cold smile that made him take an involuntary step backward. I leaned into my microphone and told him that was exactly why I did not just call the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told him I called the Internal Revenue Service because forensic math does not care about old money lineage or racial superiority. Math only cares about the truth and the absolute paper trail of stolen money. And the truth was currently standing right behind me. The men in the tactical jackets stepped out of the shadows and forward into the harsh lighting of the room. The bold yellow letters reading IRSCID and FBI across their tactical vests were impossible to miss. They were not hotel security. They were the absolute full weight of the federal government. The lead agent, a tall, imposing woman with zero tolerance for Spencer theatrics, pulled a thick stack of federal warrants from her vest. My father, Calvin, let out a choked gasp, clutching his chest as he stumbled back against the catered buffet table. He and my mother, Brenda, had spent every last penny of their retirement savings to buy their lavish outfits for this gala. They had blindly believed that Spencer was seconds away from securing the mega deal that would save their generational home from the defaulted mortgage. They had bankrupted themselves to look the part of wealthy elite in-laws. Now they were watching their absolute last hope evaporate into thin air. My mother covered her mouth with her hands, letting out a low, pathetic wail, as she finally realized that her precious son-in-law was not a billionaire savior. He was the architect of their total destruction. I turned my attention back to the room and decided to dismantle the very foundation of Spencer existence. I told everyone present that the old money lineage Spencer constantly bragged about was a complete and total fabrication. He was not the heir to a venture capital fortune. He was not a Wall Street prodigy who had decided to grace our community with his presence and his business acumen. I laid out the forensic history of the man my sister had married. His real name was not even Spencer. He was a serial con artist, a parasite who specifically preyed on upwardly mobile black families who were desperate for status validation. I spoke into the microphone, my words echoing through the silent room, detailing exactly how he operated. He targeted families like mine, families where the parents were so deeply insecure about their social standing that they would blindly accept a white savior in a custom suit. He found my parents to be the perfect marks. They were obsessed with appearances and absolutely terrified of losing their spot in the black upper-middle-class hierarchy of Atlanta. Spencer knew exactly what to say to them. He used financial buzzwords and dropped fake names of elite country clubs to make my parents feel like they had finally arrived at the peak of society. He isolated Brielle using her own vanity and immense greed against her, turning her into an unwitting accomplice and a human prop for his scams. I detailed how he had run this exact same grift in 3 different states before moving to Atlanta. He would infiltrate a wealthy black church community target, a family with more money and social ambition than common sense, and bleed them completely dry before vanishing in the middle of the night. He would use their good credit, their clean background checks, and their social connections to secure fraudulent bridge loans and open offshore shell companies. My mother had willingly handed over my social security number to help him secure a loan because she was so blinded by the proximity to his fake whiteness and his fake wealth. She had willingly betrayed her own daughter to fund a ghost because she wanted to brag to the church elders about her successful family. She had sold her soul for an illusion. The federal agents moved in coordinating with terrifying precision. The lead agent read Spencer his Miranda rights. her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room like a knife. She detailed the specific federal charges of wire fraud, tax evasion, identity theft, and international money laundering. Spencer tried to run. His eyes darted to the side, and he actually turned and lunged for the service doors at the back of the small stage in a desperate bid to escape. But Devin was faster. My husband stepped smoothly into his path, blocking the exit with his solid, imposing frame. Devin did not even have to lay a finger on him. The sheer imposing presence of the man my family had tried to ruin was enough to make Spencer stumble backward right into the waiting hands of the federal marshals. They grabbed his arms and slammed him forcefully against the polished mahogany table. The sound of the heavy metal handcuffs ratcheting closed around his wrists was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. The cold metallic click echoed through the room, signaling the absolute end of his reign of terror. Brielle fell to her knees on the expensive hotel carpet, sobbing hysterically. Her custom silk dress pooled around her in a ruined, crumpled mess. She reached out for Spencer, screaming his name, begging the federal agents to let him go. She kept screaming that it was a terrible mistake, that he was a billionaire, that they were supposed to fly to Paris next week to look at real estate. She was so deeply entrenched in her own delusion that her brain simply could not process the sight of her wealthy husband being treated like a common street criminal. She clawed at the carpet, her perfect life shattering into a million irreparable pieces. My father tried one last pathetic attempt to intervene. He stepped forward, raising his hands, trying to use his booming voice to command the room, just like he did when he stood at the church pulpit. He told the federal agents they were making a massive mistake and that he personally vouched for Spencer's character and business dealings. The lead FBI agent turned to Calvin, her expression completely devoid of pity. She reached into her tactical vest and handed my father a separate piece of paper. It was a federal subpoena. She told my father that his unexplainable sudden wealth, his involvement in the fraudulent sale of my property, and his signature on multiple fake corporate documents had triggered a secondary federal investigation. She informed him that all of his personal and business bank accounts were currently being frozen, pending a full forensic audit of his church finances and personal assets. Calvin staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. He clutched his chest, his breathing becoming ragged and shallow. His face turned a sickly shade of gray as his entire world, his reputation, his home, and his freedom completely imploded in front of his eyes. Brenda ran to his side, crying and wailing uncontrollably. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and pure hatred. She accused me of destroying the family. She screamed that I had ruined Brielle's life and sent an innocent man to prison out of pure spite and jealousy. I looked down from the stage at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had stolen my identity and eagerly sold my future to a con man just to maintain her social status. I felt absolutely no pity for her. I felt nothing but a cold, chilling clarity. I spoke into the microphone one last time, ensuring every single person in the room heard me. I told my mother that I did not destroy the family. I simply exposed the rot that had been festering under the floorboards for decades. I told her that she and Dad had sold their souls for a front-row seat at a fake charity gala. They had traded their own daughter for a lie, dressed up in a tailored suit. They wanted to be part of the elite so badly that they gladly let a parasite drain their generational wealth until there was nothing left but a defaulted mortgage, fake deeds, and empty retirement accounts. The foreign investors quietly packed up their leather briefcases and slipped out the side doors, accompanied by their translators and private security details. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the messy federal bust unfolding in front of them. The massive ballroom outside the private doors was descending into absolute chaos. The guests who had been drinking expensive champagne just moments before were now watching uniformed police officers and federal agents swarm the building, securing documents and freezing assets. The live jazz music had abruptly stopped, replaced by the static of police radios and the frantic murmurs of the Atlanta elite, realizing they had been completely duped by the very people they admired. The agents hauled Spencer up from the table roughly. His custom suit was rumpled, his face pale and sweating profusely. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated venom as they marched him off the stage and toward the main doors. He opened his mouth to spit one last racial slur, but Devin stepped forward, putting himself firmly between me and the man who had tried to ruin us. Devin looked Spencer dead in the eye and quietly told him to enjoy his new life in federal prison, where his fake money and fake lineage would mean absolutely nothing. I stood on the stage and watched the federal marshals drag Spencer away in handcuffs. Brielle was still on the floor weeping into her hands, a broken shell of the arrogant golden child she used to be. My parents were huddled in the corner, shattered and terrified of the impending federal audit that would strip away the last remaining shreds of their dignity and freedom. The grand illusion was over. The billionaire savior was a fraud. The old money lineage was a lie. The fake empire had burned to the ground exactly as I had meticulously planned. We stepped out of the private room, but the chaos we had ignited refused to stay contained behind those heavy mahogany doors. The federal agents were already moving systematically through the venue, securing documents and detaining Spencer associates. Brielle burst through the doors right behind us, sobbing so violently she could barely catch her breath. Her entire reality had just been obliterated, and her brain was frantically trying to reject the truth. She lunged toward the hotel bar, pushing past the bewildered guests who were still holding their half-empty champagne flutes. She was desperate to order a drink, or perhaps she was trying to run her credit card to settle the hotel tab before the management realized her billionaire husband was a federal criminal. She slammed her heavy gold card onto the marble counter, screaming at the bartender to run it. The bartender, looking terrified, swiped the card through the terminal. It beeped angrily and the screen flashed red. Declined. She shrieked and threw another platinum card at him, screaming that he was incompetent and that she would have him fired. The bartender swiped the second card. Declined again. Every single card in her designer purse was rejected. The IRS had moved faster than her privileged brain could comprehend, freezing every single asset tied to Spencer's fraudulent network. In her hysterical panic, she stumbled backward from the bar, her eyes wild and searching for someone to rescue her. She caught the delicate hem of her custom $5,000 white silk dress on the sharp metal edge of a brass bar stool. She pulled away recklessly, oblivious to everything but her own terror, and the fragile fabric gave way. She collapsed to the floor, the silk ripping with a loud, sickening tear that echoed over the low murmurs of the stunned crowd. She was screaming now, pounding her perfectly manicured fists against the hotel carpet like a spoiled toddler having a tantrum. She wailed that she was wealthy, that she was a respected wife, that her cards had to work because Spencer was a financial genius. People were pulling out their phones, recording her absolute meltdown. The glittering, wealthy facade she had meticulously curated for 5 years was ending in a torn dress on the floor of a hotel bar while strangers filmed her humiliation. My parents had followed her out, their faces pale masks of absolute, unadulterated terror. They saw Devin and me walking calmly toward the main exit, and my father Calvin suddenly broke away from his weeping golden child. He sprinted across the ballroom floor, intercepting us near a massive ice sculpture of a swan that was slowly melting under the chandelier lights. My mother Brenda was right on his heels, her heavy sequins gown looking utterly ridiculous on her slumped, defeated frame. They lunged at me, grabbing at my arms, their hands shaking so violently I could feel the tremors through the fabric of my suit. "Kiera, please." My father begged, his booming, authoritative church voice reduced to a pathetic, hoarse whisper. "You have to stop this right now. Go back in there and tell the federal agents it is a massive mistake. Tell them your forensic software had a glitch. You can fix this, Kiera. You have the power to fix this. You have to do it to save the family honor." I stopped walking. The audacity of his words hung in the air between us. I looked down at their desperate, clutching hands, and I physically brushed them away. Devin stepped closer, his presence a solid, imposing wall of protection, but I did not need him to shield me from them anymore. They had absolutely no power left over me. Family honor. I asked, my voice cold and flat, cutting right through the ambient noise of the ruined gala. The honor you eagerly sold your own daughter for just to protect a white con man. You let him steal my identity. You forged documents to steal my home, and you stood on a stage writing fake charity checks while he laundered stolen gambling money through offshore accounts. There is no family honor left to save Dad. You burned it to the ground the moment you decided a fake billionaire was more valuable than your own flesh and blood. My mother was weeping loudly now, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. She begged me to have mercy, telling me that the federal agents were going to seize everything they owned. She sobbed that they would be completely destitute, that their friends would laugh at them, that the church would absolutely excommunicate them when the truth about the fraud came out. She pleaded that they were my parents, that they had raised me, and that I owed them my loyalty and protection. She reached out to grab my suit jacket, but Devin smoothly stepped in her way, his dark eyes warning her not to take another step closer to me. She recoiled, shrinking back against my father, who looked like he was on the verge of a massive heart attack. I reached into the deep pocket of my crimson suit jacket. My fingers wrapped around the heavy brass keyring I had brought with me specifically for this exact moment. I pulled out the keys to the massive suburban generational home they prized above absolutely everything else, the very home they had illegally leveraged to fund Spencer's fake empire. I walked over to a high-top glass cocktail table next to them. I dropped the heavy ring of keys onto the surface. The metal clattered loudly, making both of my parents flinch as if the sound physically hurt them. The foreclosure eviction takes effect tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock. I said, my words slicing through their desperate sobbing with surgical precision. Happy packing. I turned my back on them for the absolute final time. I linked my arms securely through Devin's arm, and we walked toward the grand exit of the ballroom. We did not rush. We moved with the steady, confident pace of people who had nothing left to hide and nothing left to fear. Behind us, the empire was completely burning to the ground. Federal agents were taping off the doors, sealing the exits, and confiscating the hotel financial records. Investors were giving panicked statements to the FBI while the hotel management aggressively demanded payment from a still hysterical Brielle. My parents were left standing completely alone next to a melting ice swan, staring at the keys to a house they no longer owned. They had bet their entire existence on the illusion of prestige and proximity to whiteness, and now they were left with absolutely nothing. We walked out through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the cool, clean night air. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets slick and reflective under the streetlights. Devin opened the passenger door of our car for me. I slid into the leather seat and let out a long, slow breath. The heavy, crushing weight I had carried for decades. The burden of being the unloved scapegoat, the constant need to prove my worth to people who were determined to misunderstand me, was permanently gone. I looked out the window as Devin started the engine. I was no longer the bitter daughter working in a cubicle. I was the woman who had burned their toxic empire to ashes, and I had never felt more alive. 6 months passed since that night at the luxury hotel. The justice system usually moves at a frustrating crawl, but when dealing with the Internal Revenue Service and federal wire fraud, it moved with a terrifying and absolute finality. Spencer's expensive defense lawyers could not save him from the mountain of digital forensic evidence I had handed over to the federal agents. His trial was incredibly brief. The judge looked at his fake venture capital structure and his long history of targeting upwardly mobile black families with absolute disgust. Spencer was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole for wire fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion. The man who once mocked my cubicle job and bragged about his fake old money lineage was now wearing a fluorescent orange jumpsuit, completely stripped of his arrogant Wall Street vocabulary and his custom-tailored suits. Brielle experienced a crash landing that broke her fragile delusion into a million unfixable pieces. The designer gowns, the country club memberships, and the international vacations evaporated overnight. Without Spencer's stolen funds, she was left with absolutely nothing but mountains of crushing debt. The federal government seized her car and her jewelry. The last I heard from mutual acquaintances, she was working as a cashier at a discount grocery store, living week to week in a rundown motel on the gloomy outskirts of the city. The golden child, who had once looked down on me with total disdain, was now bagging cheap bread and sleeping on a stained mattress. She tried to call me once asking for a temporary loan to help her get back on her feet, but I changed my number immediately after. My parents faced an even more poetic and devastating justice. The federal audit completely wiped out their remaining assets, leaving them absolutely bankrupt. The generational home they prized above all else, the house they were willing to sell my future to keep, was legally seized under my foreclosure. They were forced to pack up their belongings and move into a cramped, subsidized housing complex on the other side of town. The wealthy church community they had sacrificed my safety to impress completely shunned them. The women my mother used to gossip with now crossed the street when they saw her coming. The church elders permanently banned my father from the pulpit, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the massive fraud scandal. They lost the one thing they worshipped more than God, which was their social status. Despite the absolute silence I had established, my parents still desperately tried to reach me. They would leave long weeping voicemails on my new business phone line. My mother would cry into the receiver, using the exact same manipulative tactics she had used my entire life. She would sob about how we are blood and how family is supposed to forgive each other no matter what terrible things happen. She begged me to help them pay their rent, to remember the good times we supposedly had, and to be a dutiful, loyal daughter. My father would leave aggressive messages demanding I fix their situation, claiming my vindictive actions had destroyed his health and his family legacy. They wanted their scapegoat back. They desperately needed someone to absorb their misery and pay for their mistakes. But I never responded to a single message. I was too busy building a real, lasting legacy. I did not sell the generational home to a greedy corporate developer. Instead, Devin and I completely gutted the inside, tearing down the dark, oppressive walls that held so many terrible memories of my childhood anxiety. We renovated the entire structure, transforming it into something beautiful, bright, and profoundly necessary. We opened the Kiara Wilson Financial Literacy and Protection Center. It is a completely free resource hub specifically designed for marginalized Black women. I filled the former living room with computers and desks. I teach these women how to read complex financial documents, how to protect their credit from predatory lenders, and how to secure their independent wealth so they never have to rely on anyone else. I show them exactly how to spot financial abuse, so no one can ever steal their future the way my family tried to steal mine. Today was our official grand opening. I stood on the freshly painted front porch of the center, with Devin standing right beside me. The afternoon sun felt warm and bright against my skin, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree in the front yard. Inside the house, I could hear the beautiful sounds of women laughing and talking, building each other up in a space that used to only hold harsh criticism and toxic expectations. Devin wrapped his strong arm around my waist, kissing the side of my head and telling me how incredibly proud he was of everything I had overcome and everything I had built. My phone vibrated in my pocket, breaking the peaceful moment. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. My mother name flashed across the display, along with a missed call notification and a newly left voicemail. I knew exactly what the message would entail. It would be more crying, more guilt trips, and more desperate demands for a forced reconciliation wrapped in the poisonous disguise of family loyalty. Society constantly tells us that we must forgive our toxic relatives simply because we share DNA. They preach that family is everything, even when that family actively tries to destroy us for their own selfish gain. I did not feel angry looking at the screen. I did not feel sad or conflicted. I looked at the name of the woman who had stolen my identity and expected me to smile and suffer in silence. I felt absolutely nothing for her. I pressed my thumb against the screen, navigating to the settings menu. With one swift and absolute motion, I tapped block permanently. The screen went dark, and the connection to my painful past was permanently severed. There would be no forced apologies. There would be no tearful hugs or fake family reunions for the sake of appearances. I slid the phone back into my pocket and took a deep, clean breath. I looked up at the beautiful new sign hanging above the porch, and then smiled at my loving husband. I realized in that quiet, sunlit moment that the sweetest revenge is not watching your abusers suffer in the misery they created. The absolute greatest revenge is living a brilliantly successful and peaceful life in a beautiful world where they no longer exist. True family is not determined by blood, but by mutual respect and genuine support. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need to walk away from to save yourself. Cutting ties with toxic relatives is never a failure. It is a brave step toward healing. The absolute best revenge is not about destroying those who hurt you, but about building a beautiful, successful life where they simply no longer exist. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your journey in the comments below, and please like and subscribe for more stories of triumph and resilience.